All right, I'm going to get started so that we can sort of keep it on schedule. I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to repeat it, and if you notice anyone, the back half of the room might have some issues with legibility. Unfortunately, I was limited to 1024 by 768, so the full impact of photography can't really be felt. Also, photography on a projector kind of sucks anyways, so I apologize for some of the limitations that we're going to be dealing with here. I am Simone Ruiz, and the title of my presentation is Terminal Photography. I'm going to be talking about doing all kinds of working with images, capturing them, modifying them, etc., without using a graphical user interface. That's going to cover both command line tools and a little bit of scripting. So, why do I love this stuff? I don't know about you. So I began using computers on the command line. One of my first memories was my father setting up an Epson QX10 green screen computer in my room when he got a new IBM PC. This was running an old operating system called CPM. And from there, I also used his PC where I learned DOS. CPM and DOS are pretty much the same as far as the basic command structures. And then moving on, when Windows decided to get all graphical, bringing up the terminal in Windows was the command prompt. Very similar. And then when they went 32-bit, it's called CMD. But my favorite command line these days is Bash. I got started with Bash when I connected into a Unix system for the first time over the internet, and it felt a little weird at first, but at this point it is my native language, and I feel most comfortable in it. I am a Linux user and a system administrator, so I began getting paid more or less to work in Linux back in, I want to say 2005. Basically, I started, well, my job wasn't to do it, but I was working for a public school at the time that got a grant to put out a bunch of computers, and our IT department refused to support Linux. So we were on our own. I Googled some stuff. I connected to the local Linux user group. And not too long after that, one of them said, hey, there's this Ohio LinuxFest thing you need to come to. He wouldn't take no for an answer, so I came. And I've been coming since then. At home, I use Ubuntu. I've been using Ubuntu since the beginning, since my beginning. For a long time, I was involved with the local community in Indiana, but I haven't had a whole lot of time and energy for that lately. I used to use Ubuntu at work as well. These days, I'm in the corporate world, and we're using CentOS. So scripting and programming is kind of near and dear to me because sort of that's where I feel like you get all of the power of a computer. Like, it's great what a computer lets you do visually. If you've ever wanted to do something where you didn't already know how to do it, I really love sort of the discoverability of a graphical user interface where you can just kind of click the buttons and see what happens. But after you actually understand what's going on and you want to sort of take it to the next level, it really helps to drop into a more call and response command line way of doing things. And then once you understand that level of things, you can put them into a text file and then just say, do that, instead of having to describe it every time. And that lets you do things, you know, several hundreds of thousands of times really quickly, which I like. So Bash, again, my native language. One of the nicest things about it, if you've ever had to do batch scripting in the Windows world, is that Bash is a fully functional programming language. For the things that it's frustrating for, I tend to move to Python, and recently I've been learning Ruby, which are both excellent programming languages. I do more lower level stuff from time to time, but I'm not going to get into that here. I have been into photography since I got a little point and shoot little 110 tiny little camera in first grade. And back then, I would hit the button, and then I would have to wait a long time before I ever saw what came out of it. So I'm super excited about the digital photography revolution. Just About 10 years ago, suddenly we went from digital photography being kind of like neat to it actually being professionally viable. My camera, which I'm using to record this, takes very high resolution photos, and if I were to print them out, I could probably print them out at a poster size and it would still look pretty good compared to my first digital camera, which was pixelated on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So I'm super excited about that, and most people who are really into photography ask, what brand do you use? Canon. You tend to choose one and stick with it because they don't interoperate very well, and you've already made an investment in a DSLR camera can be fairly expensive, so you're probably not gonna, once you have a collection of accessories, switch to the competitor. They definitely have the lockdown in that hardware space. So the first tools I'm going to talk about, I feel not as interesting until you have a problem, right? So how many times have you had something like a storage device like an SD card or a hard drive crash on you? If you're like me, my main concern is my images. I would probably freak out if I lost all of my photography. So I got really good at taking dead media and reading through it to try to figure out what I can get out of it. And these are the three basic tools I'll always start with, so I'm going to just mention them. GNU DD Rescue. There are two different DD Rescues. The GNU DD Rescue is the one that I'm most familiar with and the one that I appreciate. I will be throwing up apt-get command lines to show you what packages are, and that's very Ubuntu and Debian centric, but most of the stuff will be available across your platform. So in the Ubuntu world, that's gdd rescue. The first command line here says, I want you to take whatever is on dev SDF, which is probably an SD card that's no longer reading right. I want you to write it out to this file, backup.dd, which is going to be a bit-for-bit copy of it. It needs to have a log, because it keeps track of what succeeds and doesn't. And then the -R3 says, I want you to retry 3 times. So the first time, it just starts at the beginning and goes through and says, can I read it? Yeah. Can I read it? Yeah. Can I read it? Can I read it? No? Move on. The second time, it will only go back and retry the ones that failed the first time. And then after, a third time for good measure in case it fails twice, and then it reads. After 3 times, if it's not reading, you can, depending on how much you care about it, keep trying. I've definitely kept trying long beyond the point of reasonableness and still gotten results. So it depends on how much time you want to invest on it. You might still be able to get that stuff just by trying and trying and trying. The nice thing is you're not the one trying and trying and trying. You can just set that to -R-1, walk away for a day, and come back, and your computer will give you exactly what it could find. Test disk, super important, especially if on the command line you screw up a partitioning command. And if you mess up the partition table, your operating system won't be able to find anything, but it's still there. Okay, so test disk is a really great package that just reads what's actually on the hard drive and guesses where the partitions are, fixes your partition table for you, and you're good to go. I almost broke down crying when I accidentally pointed a partition table operation at the wrong drive, which was where I had all of my photography. And I did some Googling, found test disk, it saved it like that. So, important tool for me, important tool for anyone who might accidentally screw up their partition tables. And then PhotoRec, and I'm pointing it here at a backup DD drive. So I'll use DD if I have a SD card that I suspect has photos on it, but they're inaccessible to the operating system. For instance, I used to work at a school, and I had a student come in tears because she had accidentally formatted her SD card after taking a lot of photographs at one of our events. And I said, it's okay, calm down. I'll do what I can, and I'll let you know. Well, she had just formatted it. She hadn't overwritten anything. So the way that computers work, when you format it or when you delete something, it doesn't actually remove it from the disk. It just removes the little pointer that lets you find it. So PhotoRec, which comes with test disk, which is why I didn't put the apt-get install line here. These are part of the same suite from the same people. And you'll see it's from cgsecurity.org. So PhotoRec has a really nice ncurses-based interface for these two. You just type the command in, and basically it guides you through which disk do you want to try to save. I'll point it at a DD file rather than the disk, especially if there's some hardware failures, for several reasons, which I won't necessarily get in depth to so I can survey the rest of the tools. And then it goes through and finds everything it can and dumps it out for you. So I have definitely had a lot of things, not just images, although images is the main reason I would use it. I've definitely saved some people some heartache. And so these three tools, while they don't directly involve photography per se, are tools that I, as a photographer, have used a lot of times to save myself. So moving on to the sort of largest image editing command line tool out there. I'm not going to go too far into this. ImageMagick is amazing. It's got a command line component, and it's got libraries for just about every language that I've ever thought to use with. So I'll mention the two big commands that I use are convert and mogrify, and they take a lot of the same switches, but convert, you pass it an input file, and you pass it an output file, and it takes the input file, does something to it, spits it out. If you don't give it any switches, but you change the extension there, it will understand that what you're asking it to do is to read in a JPEG and write out a GIF. Sorry. Mogrify is different in that convert will only work on one file at a time, whereas mogrify, you can pass it a bunch of files. And in this case, what I'm telling it to do is to read all of the TIFF files and change the format to JPEG. So it will know to write them back out as a JPEG. Convert will also let you do things like resize things. It'll take a percentage to make it a relative size from the original, or it'll take a specific size, which will shrink it, keeping it at the same aspect ratio to fit that size. I used that a lot for this presentation because I have very large photos, and in order to get it to fit on my really old, slow computer with 1024 by 768 VGA output, these slides were super, super slow until I decided I was going to go through and resize them down to what I needed, and suddenly the performance increased a lot. So it'll also do things like rotate here. If you put an exclamation point, it'll change the aspect ratio. I invite you to go see the ImageMagick documentation. It is excellent. If there's a specific thing you want to do with your images, it will do them. But yeah, it can do a lot of stuff. This image here is created on the command line by ImageMagick. And I totally copied this from their website, so I invite you to go check it out. But it gives it the size of the image, it describes it out in very specific, every little detail here. So I'm going to move on. I shoot in RAW a lot. I've moved less towards this because it's so time intensive to work with them later. RAW files are to JPEG files what negatives used to be to actual physical prints. If you have your negative, you can go back and reprint it. If you have your negative, you can correct for a lot of things. But if all you have is a print, then you don't have all of the information that was there to begin with. So it's kind of like taking a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. If you always go back to the original, you're going to get better results than if you start working from a point further down the stream. This is the GUI interface for UF-RAW. It also comes with a plugin for the GIMP. And more importantly for this talk, it has a batch processor. So if I take an image that I like, let's say I went and took a lot of photographs in the same light situation, but I had the wrong light setting on my camera, they might come out a weird color. I can go into RAW and say, hey, this is a neutral color. I want you to, what they call white balance the image so that the whites look white. And if I wanted to do that for 200 photographs in UF-RAW, I would have to go through each image and do that. Luckily, they let you create an ID file instead of, or in addition to, outputting a new JPEG. So in this example here, I have a file, img_053.jpg. I have applied all of the color correction in the GUI. I use the GUI a lot for figuring things out. And then I outputted an ID file. So here, I tell UF-RAW batch, I've got this configuration file that I want you to apply to every single RAW in this directory. I only had a few here for the example, but I've done this for several hundred images. And instead of sitting there for every single image and telling it what I wanted to do and saving out each file individually, I said, apply this over there, and then I went and got coffee. JHead is
sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Is that a text file?
Yes. Yes, the .uf-raw is a text file. You can go in, you can generate that by yourself. I only use the GUI because it's more convenient.
You can start it and then tweak it.
Yes, absolutely. And you can programmatically change that, right? Because it's a text file. So JPEGs have a lot of information in them, about them, in a header at the beginning of the file called exif. And sometimes it's useful to go in and tweak that. So a couple of things, if you ever go to open an image in the GIMP and it's telling you something about the rotation is weird, do you want us to fix it or not? There's a couple of things you can do with the EXIF data. You can either tell JHead, like, hey, figure out the rotation, and instead of having that as a part of the header, just fix the image to be in the right rotation. Because normally these days, the camera is not saving the file portrait if it's portrait and landscape if it's landscape. It saves them all landscape, and then sometimes it just puts in a little piece of information that says, oh, by the way, I think this image is supposed to be portrait. So by telling it, auto-rotate this, JHead will go in and actually change the image to fit what it's supposed to be. Or, if you don't care about that, you can strip all the information out, because sometimes the camera can be wrong, believe it or not. A big one that I've done is to fix timestamp drift. So I had a camera that every time I turned it off and turned it back on, it reset to January 1st, 2000 at midnight, which is super frustrating. I would take a bunch of photographs, and then I would take a bunch of photographs, and I would take a bunch of photographs, and when I went to sort them by date, they were kind of interleaved all on that date. So one thing that I could do with JHead is tell it, I want you, for this batch of photos, whatever that reset time is for me, January 1st, 2000, this is the actual time that corresponds to. And it will take them all and shift them into that time space, so they're relative to each other, they'll be correct. Another thing is if sometimes with daylight savings time, your time's going to be off by exactly an hour, you can add or remove an hour super quick to a whole. And this is all very quick. It's not actually opening the image and looking at it and doing anything with it. There's a very tiny amount of data in that header file that it needs to work with. So this one's really interesting to me. I had 2 photographers at my wedding. They had 2 different cameras. And then I had other people with their own cameras. And none of them were in sync, right? Everyone had a different clock. But using JHead, I was able to tell it, I know this camera is 53 seconds faster than this one, so shrink, take 53 seconds away from this camera, and suddenly they're lined up correctly in time. Like when you go to sort things by date. And then, in order to have the same facility of sorting when you are using something that doesn't look at EXIF data, like just a regular file browser, you can go ahead and rename or create a new file from the old one based on the timestamp, so that every image in your directory, the first part of the name is year, month, day, hour, minute, and then it shows you the file name. So for my wedding, I had 4 or 5 different sources of images. After I took all the EXIF data and lined it up, I renamed all the files, and then now, when I go through using Eye of GNOME or something and go through each file, they're coming at me in chronological order. It doesn't matter which camera they came from. If this person took a picture, then that one, then this one, then this one again, I'll see them in that order. So I really enjoyed finding this tool, and it took me like 10 minutes from saying, I bet there's a tool for that, I wonder what there is, and actually getting my results.
Does JHEAD just work with JPEGs, or will it do the same with RAW files?
I believe it works with RAW files.
Wow.
Yeah,
Cool.
and those are the 2 formats I think that have EXIF.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you append the author's copyrights and all that stuff?
Absolutely. It also will go in and recreate thumbnails, or you can set some, like you can fiddle around, because EXIF also will let you put in a small version of the large file for the kinds of programs that care about that kind of stuff. And sometimes, for instance, some less complex JPEG programs will strip all that EXIF data out, and then JHEAD will let you recreate it. So, moving on. So Hugin, I'm going to point out a few things that this does. Hugin's a great Unix-style panorama stitcher, and that's what they call it, a panorama stitcher, but it really is just a marvelous way of combining images in lots of different ways. So what these 3 examples were my camera on a tripod, and I just took a whole bunch of photographs and then threw them at Hugin, and it automatically figured out how they all fit together, created the panoramas for me. This was through the GUI side of things, so I'm not showing any command lines for that. But when you apt-get install Hugin, it comes with all the command line utilities for it. So here's the vertical ones. You'll see the projection situation, because it's actually taking that data and then thinking about it in 3D space and then letting you reproject it. So when you take it from the same point, if you take photographs in all directions, that's theoretically a sphere. And then you can tell Hugin how you want that projected out, which if you've seen maps of the Earth, which is a sphere represented flat, you can see that there's distortions and things that would be useful to correct. I'm going to repeat from earlier. If any of you in the back are interested in the command line stuff that's going to show up, that'll probably be more legible from the front half of the room. All right. So Hugin, ways of combining images. So this is 6 different images which are exposed so they were taken at the same time from the same place, but they were taken at several different exposure levels. Why? Well, if you can see the sky and the detail of the sky, you can't see any of the darkness over here. It's just underexposed. But if you can see what's going on over here on land, then the sky is overexposed. So the dynamic range of a photograph is limited. And that's just optics, that's a limitation of the real world. So in order to pretend that we can capture all of that information in one image, we take a whole bunch of different images and we tell Hugin, I want you to take all these images, figure out the best parts of them, and slap them together. So for high dynamic range, I tell it, so first I align them, because if you're hand holding a camera, there's going to be a little bit of movement. So Hugin comes with an align image stack command that's excellent, and it will correct and move them all so that the same pixel location is going to be the same spot of each image. Then Hugin comes with a tool called infuse, and if you don't tell it anything else, what it does is it figures out the best exposure, combines them all together, and gives you your output file. So from those 6 images, you get one image where the sky is visible, and you can see the sunset, as well as, well, you could on the original. Sorry, projectors don't really do photography justice. And you can still see the detail here in the ground. If you look online for HDR photos, some of them look really weird and alien, and that's because you're not usually able to see that huge dynamic range. So, combining images, another thing I like to do with Hugin is focus stacking. So another limit of optics and the real world is that there is a thing called depth of field. When you take a photograph of something, it will be sharp, assuming you have it correctly focused, but there's a depth in front of which and behind which you're not going to see any detail. And that has a function of the size of the aperture that you're taking, and you may not have control over that depending on the light. It's also a function of the focal length of your lens, which sometimes you have control with the zoom knob. And it's also a function of the distance of the focus, which is what you're changing when you turn the focus ring, is you're realigning the pieces of glass so that that distance between your camera and the thing that you're focusing on can slide back and forth. So this is 13 images of a chip of RAM. And unfortunately, you can't see the detail, but you might take my word for it that the one over here, you can see the very front of the chip of RAM, but you can't see anything else. And then I moved the focus ring just a tiny bit, took another picture, a tiny bit, took another picture, so that the one back here, this chip on the RAM is visible and in focus, but nothing else is. So the focus glides back further and further from the camera as you look through all these. And then I tell Hugin to align that image stack, because again, I was physically touching the camera, which meant it was moving. So Hugin goes through and puts them all in the right space for each other. And then I use the same command, infuse, to blend them. This time though, I tell infuse the thing that I care about isn't exposure. I tell it weigh exposure, nothing, 0. So you tell it from 0 to 1, how important is this to you in figuring it out. I don't care about exposure 0. I don't care about saturation 0. What I care about is contrast. And that's how mathematically we can tell whether or not something is in focus. If this pixel is very similar to the pixel next to it, which is very similar to the pixel next to it, that might be blurry. But if there's a high contrast between those 2 pixels, it must be in focus. So it goes through, loads all those images up, puts them all together. And also, I put down here on the bottom some image magic commands. Mogrify, take those TIFF files, format them as JPEG, and resize them to 300 by 300. Take the stacked last one and resize it to 800 by 600. Why? Because they were giant images, and this presentation was super slow until I shrank them and slapped them in there. So this one image pretends to have had the maximum depth of field available to me, because I had it cranked in one direction up here, and then I slowly added information all the way back there. So they're combined, and here it seems like we are looking at one image that has all of that in focus. Focus stacking is used a lot with macro photography. Insect heads are really fascinating in macro, but you don't see very much detail. So they use this trick to make it seem like you can see that much stuff. Gphoto 2 is an awesome tool that I've used, both on the command line and with libraries. GTCam is the GUI front end. Most of your DSLR cameras will have a USB cable. So GTCam lets you control the camera the way that you would on the menu of the camera. So you can set the time, you can set the name, the copyright information, all kinds of settings on your camera through the GUI or on the command line. So this example here would have been used to take the HDR type images. So this is a script that says, for these 5 numbers, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, which correspond to some exposure values that I'm not going to get into, do the following. Set the configuration so that the exposure compensation is this variable. Next, capture an image and download it. At the end, set the exposure back to normal. Okay? So that would take 5 images and then set your camera back to the way it was. So same kind of bracketing, but this time with speed. And I'm illustrating by holding my sink down so that the water's coming out super fast. So this is set the shutter speed to 2 seconds, to 1/60th of a second, and to 1/4000th of a second. Take those pictures, one at a time, and then set the shutter speed back to my normal setting, which is 1/60th of a second. So this is the 2-second exposure, you can't see anything. This is the normal one, which looks okay. And then this is the 1/4000th of a second, which freezes that water and you can see each individual droplet. I use Gphoto to do this time lapse. And I just told it, hey, capture and download that image, and then I threw an interval at it. And it understands if there's an interval that you want it to take multiple photographs, in this case 30 seconds apart. I did this one for 24 hours. Then I threw it at mencoder. mencoder is a front end to a lot of different encoding stuff. In this case, I gave it a folder full of JPEGs, 24,040 JPEGs or something. I gave it a name for the file I wanted to come out. I told it the scale at which I wanted, because these were much larger photographs than I really was going to be able to show here anyways. And then I said, I want you to use the LAVI codec, LAVI format, the LAVI codec for creating the format into which the things are going to go, the codec for encoding the video. I gave it the options of using MJPEG to try to compress that video a little bit, and then told it to output an AVI. So that's what was there. Motion is an interesting little daemon. This is an art installation that I helped set up from the technical side of things. It's at the Museum in Cincinnati, or it was, I'm not sure if it's still there. And you can check it out as impression.kiss on Instagram. Motion is a daemon that does motion detection. You plug a webcam in, and it will look through that webcam. And anytime that there's a change, it will save it out. So I used it to try to figure out what was going on with some rodents in my house, and where they were when I wasn't around. And then I was inspired to use the same thing for this art installation, because what it is there's a computer and then there's a webcam pointing at a mirror. And the artists were trying to figure out, well, can you help us figure out how to set it up so that, like, when they sit down, there's like a pressure plate that takes a picture, or maybe we can use lasers, and if they cross the laser, it'll take a picture. And I was like, well, why don't we just take all the pictures and only save the ones we care about? So using motion detection and a mask, which you can feed into motion and say, only care about this part of the picture. When somebody interacts with this part of the picture, save that information off. So this little Ubuntu machine was running this daemon, saving all kinds of stuff into their Dropbox directory, and then Dropbox was syncing it up to the internet. And so at home, they would look through all the images, find the cool ones, and slap them up on Instagram. So this is the long, frustrating part of why I got super into the following tools. I got a job at Salesforce recently, and I moved to Indianapolis. They had just recently bought the naming rights to the tallest building in the state, which was formerly known as Chase Tower. I had moved down there, and I was fiddling around with my camera, as I tend to do, and I set my camera up to take a time lapse of the skyline from my apartment. When I did the time lapse and I went to view it, what I found was that they were taking down the Chase sign. And so I got a time lapse of the skyline while they were taking down the Chase sign. I used some of these tools that I'm about to speak about to capture just the part that had the Chase sign, and I posted that to my company social network, and I said, hey guys, check this out, isn't that kind of interesting? And people kind of liked it and all. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I got them putting the sign up? But I'd like to get the whole process. So I got a hold of a lady in real estate, and she liked my idea. So she gave me use of an office on the south side. So they took down the sign on the north side, and then they took down the sign on the south side, and then they put up the sign on the south side, and they put up the sign on the north side. So there was this whole period of time when they were working up there, and I just set up, because we had no idea when. We just knew sometime in the next month they're going to do it. I just set my camera up to take pictures indefinitely. So these were something like 12 megapixel pictures, 1 per minute, for 21 days. I use Magic Lantern, not a command line utility, but I want to push them because they're awesome. Magic Lantern is a hack for lots of different cameras. I use it on my Canon. It's a firmware, it's not a firmware upgrade, but it uses the firmware upgrade facility of the camera. So you save a little file onto your SD card, you pop it into your Canon, you run the firmware update facility, and what it does is it installs Magic Lantern to that SD card. So you can take the SD card out, put another one in, it's right back to normal Canon. Put your Magic Lantern SD card in, and you got Magic Lantern. Magic Lantern, it gives you all the features that Canon didn't want to give you. They don't support it, but I don't care. Incidentally, I'm using Magic Lantern right now to get around a a business limitation of modern Canon cameras is that they are restricted to 30-minute videos. There's no reason for that, except I hear maybe European tax law, I don't know. But it's irritating, and this presentation is longer than 30 minutes. So Magic Lantern on my camera, I told it, when the video stops, start another video. Then I'm going to take the two and combine them. There's going to be about a 1-second cutoff in there at one point, but can't get around that one. So I have 21 days of 1 photograph per minute. And basic file management is a nightmare. It's just a horrible, horrible nightmare. So normally when I'm working on photography, I will use the GUI. Like I just open up the folder, the thumbnails are great, I can find the stuff I want, but when you have tens of thousands of photos, it really slows things down. Like I just bought a new computer that has 8 cores and like 16 gigs of RAM, and it choked hard every time I tried to work with these images. So it wasn't fun anymore. That's my big point. I was like, but I committed to doing this project. I was like, hey, if you let me set up my camera, I'll take a time lapse and then I'll share it with the company. And it wasn't fun anymore. So I had to figure out how to script it. One of the big problems that I had to figure out how to get around were all the different folders and files. So as a result of legacy file systems, FAT, the file allocation table file system, all the images that you get out of Canon cameras and most professional cameras are limited in the way that they're shown. So all the images out of a Canon camera are img underscore and then 4 numbers .jpeg, or CR2 for the RAWs. I took all of these in JPEG because RAWs were far too large for what I was trying to do. Then they get also put into folders because they understand sometimes you're going to buy a camera and take more than 10,000 photographs with it. So every time it rolls over from 9999.jpg back to 0001, it creates a new folder. So the first one is 100 Canon, then it's 101 Canon, then it's 102 Canon. But if you take and copy all your images off, it goes back to 101 Canon. So if you were just to try to throw everything into one folder, there's all kinds of name collision issues that come up with. So what I tend to do is I create a folder called dump01, and I put everything in there. And then dump02, and I put everything in there. So this is the tree of images that I had for this project. So I had dump1, and all the images in there. Dump 2 had 100 Canon and 101 Canon and all the images from those. All the way through to dump 7 had 100 Canon and a bunch of images there. So I had 16 total directories with 32,675 files to work with, each at about 6 megabytes, and that was totally choking my workflow. Enter scripting. This is super basic file utils in Ruby. All I did is go through and, so alphabetically, because of the way I'd named things, if they were ordered alphabetically, they were in the correct order. So I just said, take all of the originals and create a link folder, so it doesn't take, so each link doesn't take up a file, it's just a pointer. It's like a Windows shortcut, but better. And in that links directory, start at 00001.jpg and then move on up. So now I have a folder called links that has references to all of my photographs. If I make a mistake, I should just delete that links directory and start over from scratch. No big deal. Still, this one folder, if I try to open it up, is going to choke my file manager too. Because each of these images is almost around 6 megabytes. The size of it goes up and down depending on the complexity of the image. And I, in order to work with it, wanted to kind of make thumbnail size ones so that I could tell which ones had the information I cared about. Because what I was going to do was just delete everything I didn't care about and take what was left and make a video out of it. So in order to shrink them to this size, I used ImageMagick. This is just the same stuff from one of my first slides in a Ruby script format. So I went through for every image and shrunk it. One thing that was frustrating to me was every time I worked with ImageMagick, it pegged one of my 8 CPUs and the rest of my computer sat doing nothing. So in Ruby, I took all of the files in that links directory, broke it up into 8 equally sized chunks of files, forked 8 processes, and told each of those processes, these are the images you work on. These are the images you work on. And so I actually got my whole computer, finally, after buying it, I finally got all the processors doing something I cared about. And it was kind of a nice feeling. Then, also a similar structure for my Ruby script on this one, I took all of the images in that smaller thumbnail directory that still existed, because they had names corresponding to the original ones in the links directory, right? I said all of the surviving images in the small image directory, find the link to the original file for that, crop it to the part of the image I cared about, rotate it, because it, like I mentioned with the XF data, this is what the JPEG files look like, but I wanted this part of the image that way. So this says, go to 4345 by 1525, take an image that's 336 by 573 square, rotate it 90 degrees, and write that out to another folder, my cropped rotated logo folder. And so this one spun around for a while, all 8 of my processors working on their images. And then when that was all done, I had one folder, CR logo, that had only the images I cared about, only the part of them I cared about, rotated correctly. And then I used FFmpeg. I told it 30 frames per second. Take all of these files, give me an AVI. So it took me a long time to make this video.
Is this like 1 frame per?
It's 1 frame per minute,
Okay.
but I cut out a lot.
Oh.
So this is 3 weeks worth of images, only the parts of it that I cared about. And I took the last day that they had the chase sign on. So at the beginning the chase sign was lit, and it turned off, and it goes. And then I cut everything out until they actually did the work of tearing down the chase sign. And each of the times that they worked on it, it took several days. So they pulled down the little bits of the chase logo, and they tore down the backdrop, and then they put up a new backdrop, and they put up some of the signage, And they made mistakes, which I have forgiven them for by removing images. The L, they brought it up, maybe upside down or something, but I saw them move it over and back, and then over and back, and then back over, and that time they attached it. And they did that a couple times. So this is a totally idealized, pretending to be one day of work, but it actually was spread around 3 weeks. And that is the extent of my slides. I am open for questions, and I think we're good on time.
Anything?
Lady in red.
With your time lapses, have you ever done something where you like combine them with the previous image to clean up some noise?
I haven't yet, no. But I think Hugin, which does the image stacking, is a tool that I would have used for that. One thing I didn't get to do, which I would have liked to do, was using that align image stack tool to correct for, because it wasn't super pronounced, which is why I gave up on really caring about it, but the camera did move a little bit over the course of those 3 weeks, and it kind of like glided down a tiny bit. So the first few images are a few pixels higher than the next few, and so I've seen people use that tool, the Hugin suite, to take like shaky video. I don't know if you've ever seen like the Star Trek bridge when they mathematically keep it from shaking. It's pretty funny. But I've seen people and tutorials for using that tool to fix camera shake in software, and I think I've seen people use it to correct for noise as well. Yeah.
Oh, anything to handle like PTC data?
I'm sorry?
Any PTC data, which is similar to the
To the XF?
Yeah.
I haven't had a need for that myself. I don't know if JHead would. It might be worth looking into. It's a fairly mature product, and I wouldn't be surprised since it's an analogous issue if they say, oh well, let's just consider these two different formats of the same thing.
Thanks for the talk, Simone. Any comments on image magic versus graphics magic?
No, I'm not aware of.
Yeah, just
much
graphics
difference.
magic forked at some point, and so it's always interesting to know like where things are for people who use them more.
I've not used graphics magic myself. I haven't used graphics magic. I got started with image magic, and I haven't really felt a need to move yet. Back here.
Why did you use the previous tools to mentioning MPEG when I understand MPEG will do just about all of it?
What did I use? M-encoder first? So the time lapse, the first time lapse I took a couple of years ago, and then most recently I used FFmpeg. I understand that M-encoder will use FFmpeg if it needs to, so it's kind of another layer abstracted from what's going on. I don't have a really great reason for that. One big thing I would say about this one is that I was really looking at quality. I didn't want to compress it at all. I took this and I threw it up to YouTube and let YouTube deal with the compression and everything. So I don't know if these days I would prefer somebody else do that, figuring out what the best compression and everything is. And back then, that wasn't really available.
There's also a GUI front end for FFmpeg.
As long as what it does is just give you the command line at the end, then I would probably wind up taking a look at that. But usually, at this point, I just... there was a question over here. Yeah.
Yeah. I saw that there's two different things. There's Magic Lantern and there's CHDK. Do you know if there's like differences between them, and are they like compatible on the same cameras?
There are definitely differences. CHDK is actually a Canon hack, and it works primarily on Canon cameras, if I understand correctly, and it might replace the software on your camera.
Okay.
Magic Lantern is a much more universal tool in that it supports thousands of cameras. You can go to the Magic Lantern site and they've got a list so you can check compatibility. But I'll tell you the big difference for me, because I knew about CHDK but not Magic Lantern, is I went to try to get CHDK to get it to work on my camera, and the instructions for that were seriously complex, and I don't know that I was able to find the exact firmware for my exact model. But while I was searching for that, Magic Lantern came up, and I took a glance at it, and I was like, well, that sounds interesting. If that works, it'll do what I need. And like literally 5 minutes later, it was up and running on my camera. I just downloaded that file and updated the firmware, and boom. Yeah.
All right, so I missed a good portion of the beginning of your talk, and I see that you're recording it. Is that going to be available to watch just pretty much anywhere?
I hope so. Assuming that the video comes out correctly, and well, what I'm going to probably do is throw it up on YouTube, and then I'll share that on the Ohio LinuxFest Facebook group.
Okay, because my wife would definitely be interested in this.
Awesome. Yeah. I also would like to show some of my friends who weren't able to come as well. Third time's the charm. Are there any other questions? Comments? Feedback?
How much of your closet space is dedicated for gaming accessories?
I have a shelf. I have a full shelf. I've got lenses. I've got a power adapter for it. Some extra batteries and stuff. 3 or 4 tripods. I brought the Monster Pod or Gorilla Pod with me because I figured I wouldn't really have the space to set up the big tripod, and it worked out pretty well to attach it to that chair. Anything else? I'm pretty close to time. So thank you.